Welcome, everyone. We apologize for the delay. We're going to be getting underway in just a minute or two. We are doing webinar style tonight, so people are muted, and there will, as you'll hear from our chair, there will be some opportunities later on for participation, and how that'll happen will be explained to you. So welcome, everyone. We're just waiting until everybody gets in from the meeting room before we begin. And Doug, over to you.
Thanks very much, Susan. My name's Doug Hamilton. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Toronto-Danforth NDP Outreach Committee. We're the group that put the event tonight together, and we're so happy to have such a good response to tonight's panel discussion, which is Undemocratic and Unethical, how Doug Ford's conservative government is eroding our democracy and threatening our environment. We are, of course, as part of the vagaries of Zoom meetings, we are have our panelists who are joining us are a little delayed, but the meeting will be starting with a short film. It's Naomi Klein talking about her book, Shock Doctrine, which we felt was a bit of a piece of the conservative use of crises to do things. There'll be a more fulsome introduction of that. After the film, there will be a panel discussion, but also plenty of time after the panelists have spoken for people to ask questions. If you have questions before that, please feel free to use the chat function to write your questions out. And then when we're in the question and answer part of the meeting, please use the raise hand function under reactions. But before we get to anything else, one of the things we do as a matter of course is start all of our meetings with a land acknowledgement. And I'd like to hand things over to Debbie Bryson to do that.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. We acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit people. And I think it goes over to David. Thank you.
I first want to introduce Cinema Politica Danforth to those of you who are not familiar with us. We're a project of the Outreach Committee of the Toronto-Danforth NDP Riding Association. And our normal format over the last decade has been to show films followed by a discussion. During the pandemic, we've had to move online with shorter films and longer discussions. We're looking forward to the time when we can all get together and watch a good political film. This evening, we have an opportunity to begin with a short but controversial film about modern politics based on a wonderful book by Canadian author Naomi Klein. Written in 2007, The Shock Doctrine, subtitled The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. And it's about right-wing extremists inspired by the economists at the University of Chicago, who called on governments to prepare for a crisis and use shock and awe to cause change. Klein warned that these extremists are ready to go, waiting for a crisis that they can take advantage of using torture and violence, as occurred in Chile in 1973, collapse of the USSR in 1991, and the rise of Putin, the Mexican tequila crisis of 1994, the Asian financial crisis of 1997. Our Canadian free marketeers aren't that violent and less likely to use shock and awe tactics to exploit crises. But they still assume that only a crisis produces real change, and that leads to a wave of privatizations. Let's watch the film, and afterwards I'll make a few more comments. Thanks.
I got really interested in the idea of shock and its use as a political tool when I was in Iraq covering the occupation, because there was this almost triple storm of shock going on in that country. There was the first shock, which was the shock and awe invasion, which was followed immediately after by economic shock therapy, more radical than had been attempted even in the former Soviet Union, just a complete overhaul of the economy overnight. That's at least what was attempted. And then there was this third shock, which came into play after people started resisting the occupation and those other two shocks, and that was the shock of torture. And I became interested in why it was that the architects of the invasion and occupation of Iraq had chosen this as their metaphor. And what was it about the idea of shock that was so appealing to the people who wanted to remake Iraq? And I started to actually try to go back to the source of the metaphor of shock therapy. So I started reading about its use in psychiatric contexts and also its use in torture. And that led me to a really close reading of the declassified CIA interrogation manuals that were first published in 1963 and in the 80s, reprinted and have since been declassified. And looking at how the CIA talks about the importance of putting prisoners into a state of shock, because when they're in a state of shock, they're not able to protect their interests. They become childlike and regressed. The interrogation manuals are really obsessed with this idea of regression. So I started to think about how that had been applied on a mass scale. The exploitation of crisis and shock has very consciously been used by radical free marketeers. And I start the book quoting Milton Friedman, where it's something he wrote in 1982, "Only a crisis, real or perceived, produces real change." And he was admitting that his ideas, his vision of a radical privatized world couldn't be imposed in the absence of a crisis. He was referring to economic crises, and economic crises have played that role of sort of softening the ground for the imposition of shock therapy. The Asian economic crisis was a classic example. The so-called tequila crisis in Mexico was another one that unleashed a wave of privatizations in Mexico. But as people become more resistant and more aware of these strategies, and you see these mass mobilizations against the institutions that exploited shock, like the International Monetary Fund, then what starts to happen is the shocks need to get bigger in order for the disorientation to be greater. And that's where you have what I call disaster capitalism. What the Bush administration did after September 11th, when the war on terror was declared, is they essentially launched a new economy. Because the parameters of this economy were extraordinarily wide. This is an endless war, we were told, that the enemy could not be reasoned with, there could be no diplomacy, there could be no discussion, there could only be attack, and that it would not end until evil was defeated everywhere, right? So if you think of it as a business plan, it could hardly be more profitable, because basically what you're saying is you've got this new market, it's never going to end, and we have unlimited funds to finance this new market. So unlike a one-off war, what they were building was a permanent new part of the economy, a privatized security state. One other thing Milton Friedman said is that after the crisis hits, the kind of change will depend on the ideas that are lying around. And that's really what the University of Chicago Economics Department was producing all of those years, were ideas that would be lying around when the next crisis hit, being prepared for that crisis. And so it's not a question of we don't need some vast conspiracy to say, that these crises are being deliberately planned and created so that they can be exploited. Now, certainly there are some cases of deliberate shocks that were then exploited. Like the book starts with the coup in Chile, which was obviously a planned attack that put a country into shock, and then was exploited for the sort of first classic case of economic shock therapy. The war in Iraq was, of course, planned as well, and planned to be as shocking as possible, called shock and awe, so that it could be exploited. But I think in most cases, it's not about planning the original shock. It's about being in an acute state of intellectual disaster preparedness, so that when the crisis hits, you're the ones who are ready with the ideas that are lying around. And so that's what happened when the levees broke, is that the Heritage Foundation was ready with their 32 free market solutions for Hurricane Katrina. And the first one was roll back labor standards. The next one was school vouchers instead of public school funding, and on and on. So they were ready to go. And it's easy to be ready when you have the same ideas, no matter what the crisis is. Even though the material in the book is depressing. I mean, it's horrifying to read about all these moments where people were taken advantage of when they couldn't defend themselves, and just the way in which torture and other forms of extreme violence have been used to impose this ideology. I don't find it completely depressing, and I'll tell you why. Before I did this research, I accepted, like most people, a large part of the narrative that the triumph of the free market around the world in the 80s and 90s was a largely peaceful process, and that in fact there, even though we progressives don't admit that there is no alternative, we lost faith in our alternatives, and we accepted this narrative that there was a great battle of ideas and that we lost that battle. And when we look back, and this is what I do in the book, is I look at key chapters where this free market ideology has had its leaps forward, like the coup in Chile, then the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the breaking apart of the Soviet Union, Poland in 1989, Tiananmen Square in 1989, and looking at these key junctures where you had these big leaps forward from Milton Friedman's ideology. And what you see at these moments is that it actually never was chosen. And the fact that we can look and say, okay, well, what did Polish voters vote for in 1989? They voted for a party that was promising not to privatize their state companies, but to turn them into workers' co-ops. And what did South Africans vote for in 1994? They voted for a party that was promising to take the rich resources of that country that was in the hands of a tiny elite and redistribute them. What did Russians want in 1993? Most of them believe that privatization should also be done through worker ownership. And these ideas were blasted out of the way through various forms of shock and violence. But it wasn't that we didn't have the ideas, and it wasn't that we ever consented. It wasn't that we were ever convinced of the rightness. We just succumbed at various points. And I actually think it's quite empowering to realize that we didn't lose this battle of ideas, because I think that a lot of what weakens us on the left is this notion that is repeated again and again, that our ideas have tried and failed, that they're discredited. And that, I think, keeps us from having the strength of our conviction in key moments. So that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, to say it wasn't a battle of ideas, it was a real battle. It was a real war with real casualties. So we came up against brutal forces and we lost, but we didn't lose the argument.
Was that the end of the film? Just wanted to confirm with folks. I've seen it so many times. I'm assuming it was. Anyway, I'm going to go on. Naomi Klein warned us that when the left loses faith in our alternatives, the free market leaps forward. That's the situation we're facing here in Ontario today. We are witnessing what you might call crisis opportunism. The right will find either a convenient crisis to oppose their agenda or create such a crisis. And those with a right-wing privatization agenda can either take advantage of a convenient crisis like a pandemic, or create one, such as in healthcare or housing, to impose their agenda. Can I ask our organizers if we have a speaker ready to go, or should we have a discussion about the film?
I don't see any of the three panelists having checked in, pardon me, so far. One option is to introduce Peter, and another is to take a moment to discuss the film.
Can I say that I'm quite willing to step in for the moment to moderate, make some comments, and if our panelists continue to be delayed, that we can go to a discussion of the film. I wanted to say welcome to everyone who showed up this evening. It's really great to see you. It's very large numbers, and I see a lot of friends out there and folks from as far afield as Stratford and beyond. So welcome tonight. It's really good to have you here. I found Naomi Klein's comments very useful. Obviously, we're not dealing in Ontario with a military situation. It may feel that way some days, but we're not. But we are dealing with a situation that was touched on by David, where we are facing crises that in many ways have been created by the government of the day. And it's been fascinating for me, fascinating and on days horrifying, to watch the way Doug Ford and his ministers handle the crises in front of them. So I'll touch on them briefly because our panelists will actually do a much better job than I will. On the healthcare file, it has been apparent the last few years that our healthcare system has been stretched to the limit. It's also been apparent that the heart of that has been underinvestment, a failure to put money into our healthcare system, and even more importantly, a failure to properly pay and treat with respect the workers who actually deliver the healthcare that we need. And that has led to demoralization, and it's led to people bailing out of the system. And that has had a snowball effect as more and more people feel demoralized, feel that they have no future, feel burnt out. They leave the system and things start breaking down. So this past year, after the provincial election, we've seen more and more emergency departments closing in hospitals for nights, for weekends, for weeks at a time. Not so much in Toronto, although from talking to some doctors and nurses, they've been forced into situations where departments have been closed and you get a silent closure. You close a department, it's not the emergency, and you move people into emergency. Still a reduction in overall healthcare services. And what that has said to people has been the system is not working. And when you go into the legislature and look at the solutions that are being put forward by the premier and his ministers, they're fairly straightforward. Well, the status quo isn't working. Let's turn to the private sector. They'll save us. They'll spend their money and look after everyone. And this idea that big investors operate like charities is pretty bizarre, but it is their message track. And for us in the opposition in the NDP, we can't explain what's going on other than understanding the government's decided to make a crisis so that privatization of the healthcare system can proceed. We see in their spending from year to year that they're underspending their budgets. So if in fact you needed money to pay nurses, pay PSWs, pay technicians and cleaners more so that you didn't lose staff in our hospitals, you could actually do that. They've chosen not to. And that has driven those people out and caused the crisis that we're seeing in those hospitals. So I'd say that there is a shock. People are seeing that their lives are threatened or at risk when they can't get health care. And I have to say to everyone, as I go door to door talking to people about preserving public health care, it's very interesting to me to come across people who say, you know, I just need the care. I don't actually worry anymore about having to pay money. I'm in pain and I want things dealt with now. And that is a very powerful position for the government to be in. And when we go back at them in the legislature, they're very clear that we are in a crisis. They're right. We know what the solution is. They're wrong. privatization is not the solution. And we're responding to what people want. And what people want is healthcare when they need it. So we actually have been able to watch this dynamic play out in real time. I'll talk briefly about housing in the Greenbelt. I know Phil Pothen has been on these Zoom town halls with me before. Very knowledgeable guy. He will speak about things in far greater detail than me. But it's been interesting to see that the shield that the Tories use to defend themselves when we go after them on the Greenbelt is very simply, there's a housing crisis. People can't get homes. If we develop the Greenbelt, there'll be all kinds of houses. There'll be this big production and people will get homes. Well, they're omitting a number of things. One, we have more than enough land in Ontario, not in the Greenbelt, more than enough land around the GTA to provide spaces for more than 2 million homes. The Greenbelt is not needed for that. But when you repeat something often enough, it sort of sinks into people's consciousness and it's hard to get out. And their line consistently is, you in the opposition, you and the NDP don't want people to have homes. We do. We're willing to take the political heat to solve this crisis. So they have put people in a situation where they can't afford a home. They're desperate, and the Tories are taking advantage of the state of mind that we're dealing with. I'm going to speak briefly about the education system as well, and I look forward to hearing Laura Walton talk about her experiences. Her leadership was one of the great bright lights of 2022 last fall when she and the education workers took on Doug Ford. They were, I would say, courageous. They were running big risks of personal fines, and they raised the stakes high enough that Ford had to back off. Everyone should be aware that what we've seen in health is what we're seeing in education. The imposition of the wage cap, Bill 124, has meant a lot of people have been put in desperate situations. They're demoralized, they feel disrespected, and so you get big turnover in the education system. You find that the quality of the education, even with the huge, amazing efforts on the part of educators, is not what we need it to be, that our children are not getting the extra support that they need. I'm sure all of you remember Education Minister Lecce's promise to provide a bonus to families so that they could hire tutors. Well, the amounts were laughable because there was not enough money there to actually provide the tutoring support that was needed to make up for lost class time. But it is symptomatic of where they go. They're willing to put money into private enterprises, private education, not willing to put it into public education. And as parents and children get frustrated with the lack of support in the schools or declining physical spaces in the schools, they make things far friendlier for all of the private entrepreneurs who want to provide private education. I have to say to you, time passes. 17 years I've been in the legislature. It wasn't until Ford came in that I was ever in receipt of literature and letters and communications from private schools saying, we want to talk to you about the expansion of private schools in Ontario. We have a product to offer. We can give your constituents a better deal. Now, my constituents don't have the kind of money you need to pay for private education for their kids. But some of them they're squeezing themselves because they found that in the public system, they weren't getting all the support that they needed. And particularly at the heart of the pandemic, when Ford and company wouldn't make the investments for smaller classes, wouldn't make the investments for ventilation. Parents and kids were saying, we're not happy with the safety levels. This is a substantial problem. So I'd say, David, what Naomi Klein has done with her book, The Shock Doctrine, and with her short speech on YouTube, has correctly pointed out that right-wing governments will create crises and then take advantage of them. Everyone remembers John Snowbelin, who was the education minister under Mike Harris back in the 90s, who was famously quoted about the need to create a crisis and actually in order to make the change that he wanted to make in the education system. And indeed, they did create a crisis. I was on Toronto City Council at the time and remember the kinds of conflicts that teachers and education workers were subject to as Harris really assaulted the education system that we had in this province. So I think the premise that we're operating from is a reasonable one. We have evidence of it on a daily basis dealing with this government. I think the question for all of us is how best to take it on. I'm hoping that our panelists, and we've got a really strong panel tonight. It's unfortunate. One of our panelists had to zoom into Toronto today and was out on the highway partway home to Oshawa, and texted me and just said she was very sorry, emergency, she was on her way, she hoped to be home very soon, and as soon as she gets in, we'll put her on. What I would suggest then, in the absence of those panelists, is
Peter,
that pardon?
if I can interrupt, Peter,
Yes.
both Bill and Laura are here with us.
Well, what do you know? The high quality has arrived. And so I think I'll start with Laura. Laura, if you don't mind, is president of the Ontario School Board Council of Unions. She was formerly president of QP 1022, representing education workers at Hastings and Prince Edward County District School Board. Last fall, Laura led thousands of educational workers to the picket lines to successfully, I underline successfully, protest the Ontario government's use of controversial legislation and to fight for higher pay for workers. Laura, you're an amazing example, an inspiration for all of us. And with that, I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, and so great to see you. And I want to apologize again for lateness. I still haven't managed how to teleport across the province. And once I can figure that out, we will be in good stead. Super excited to be with all of you here this evening. And any chance that we have I have an opportunity to talk to folks about the work that education workers did is important. But I think it's also important to bring it back around to what workers and what people did in general and how we collectively can do it. I was just in Ottawa today talking to some federal workers, and they were saying to me, well, yeah, you did that. This is, the province, but how can we do it? And I'm here to tell you that regardless of what your issue is, whether it is a unionized labor force, whether it is a community issue, or whether it's a broader scale issue, such as attacks on the Greenbelt, the system that education workers used and put in place is what made us successful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that before we went on, just to catch people up. I am proud to be the president of 55,000 education workers across the province of Ontario. We are in all four school systems, the French Catholic, French Public, English Public, and English Catholic. And we were coming out of a really rough road. In 2012, the Liberal government came in and stripped our collective agreements with Bill 115. They took away our gratuities and they froze our wages. 2 years later, in 2014, the same Liberal Party came in and said, you know what, from now on, you need to bargain with the government of Ontario, but you have to do a two-tiered system. All money items are up at the province, up in the province, and then language has to be dealt with at a local level. And then, we had Doug Ford come along, and Doug Ford basically looked at what the Liberals had done with Bill 115 and said, hey, hold my beer, we're going to do something better. And while we were sitting at the bargaining table, Doug Ford decided that he would put into place Bill 124. And what Bill 124 did was cap all of our wages at 1%. So what you had was already low-paid workers who had lived through 4 years of zeros and then 3 years of ones in the last decade. And we were falling further and further and further behind. We combined that with a real significant issue when the pandemic happened, where these education workers, many of you probably heard schools were closed, people talked about schools being closed, but education workers were actually on site throughout the entire pandemic in our schools, providing supports and maintaining our public properties so that they were not damaged or not, destroyed in any way. But we were not considered, essential. We were not provided any pandemic pay. In fact, we had to fight, and Peter and his team at the NDP helped us in fighting to ensure that we had childcare, emergency childcare available to us. They helped us fight to ensure that we had priority for vaccinations. In fact, when the vaccination priority came out, we had many school boards and principals hand over the vaccination papers that we needed to people who were working from home. And that was a reality that didn't exist for education workers. We needed to be on site. And so what we decided that we needed to do was do things a little bit differently. And I will just start tonight by saying, if you want change, change comes from a place of discomfort. And as long as people are comfortable, people are not going to change. And you can put that into a labor context as far as negotiations. You can put that into the context of a community issue. But as long as people are comfortable, they're not going to make the changes that are needed. And so we decided at that time, coming out of, just chaotic, the most chaotic school years that we have ever seen in our history and the most chaotic in the entire North American continent, we decided that we were really going to get in touch with members who were really, experiencing a forced disengagement. And we began talking individually, one-on-one, with members. In fact, we trained up over 1,000 workers to know how to have structured organizing conversations. And in those conversations, we challenged people to get agitated. And we would say things like, what has the last decade of, legislated wages meant to you and your family? What we know from doing a wage survey is over 50% of our workers were working multiple jobs. We know that over 25% of them were experiencing food insecurity and housing insecurity. And we also know that 91% of CUPE education workers had experienced at least one financial hardship in the last year. So we went out and we started talking and we asked them, what has the impact of the last decade been on you and your family? What would you do if you could change it? And, we would hear lots of things. We would hear about how they had to move back in with their parents because they could not afford to live on their own. We heard of folks staying in very unhealthy relationships because they could not afford to go out on their own. We heard about not being able to put their children into extracurricular activities or afford post-secondary education for their children because of their low wages. And so we asked them a really important piece. And I think it's a piece that we all need to grasp onto. We understand that these are the things that are happening to you. Now, what are you going to do about them? Because for far too long, people just assumed that there was this magical entity called the union that would come in and fix things. And we believe the union is all of our members. And we actually believe that union power actually comes not just from the workers, but from the communities that we proudly serve in. So we talked to them and they said, yeah, I'd be willing to strike. I'd be willing to strike if I needed to get a wage. And we said, okay, that's great. So what would happen if this government legislated you back and told you weren't allowed to strike? And I want to share with everybody that many of you probably saw or were on our picket lines with us on November 4th. We had 55,000 members go out on the streets on November 4th. But the reason they went out is because for 4 months, we had been working through the what ifs. What if they were legislated back? What if their employer tried to fire them? What if they couldn't afford to pay the rent? And we had worked through all of those scenarios so that by the time we got to November, people knew what they needed to do in order to achieve. I will say that I personally believe that Doug Ford completely underestimated these workers, completely underestimated the labor movement, and completely underestimated the people in the province of Ontario. But he had a warning signal and he should have taken it. We had 55,000 members in our union, and our strike vote had over 45,000 members participate in the strike vote. As a matter of fact, we had more members participate and vote yes in a strike vote than any single Conservative MPP received in this past election. And we did it by using old-fashioned skills, talking to people and pulling the vote. And that should have been a sign to this government that we were ready, that members were taking into their own hands the power and the control to fight for more. And you all saw what happened. Within 48 hours of the piece of legislation being passed and receiving royal assent, Doug Ford provided in writing that he would rescind the piece of legislation, but also ensure that it would show that it never happened at all. It was completely retroactive. And that was a huge win. But the wins didn't stop there. One of the most important wins that we saw in the education sector was that workers found their voice. This is a group of workers that have been overlooked for so long, not just in my union, but in our sister union, OPSU, and our education unions like OSSTF and ETO. Workers found their voices for the very first time, and that's something that cannot be legislated away. But these workers also achieved the highest wage increase that they have seen in over a decade, and the first freely negotiated collective agreement in over a decade. I can tell you that I've been an EA for 20 years, and I have never received $1 an hour increase in my entire career, including when, the Liberals were trying to court us and be our friends. So people have really started to learn, the power that exists when we come together, regardless of flags, regardless of, organizations. And we have actually boldly went where we haven't gone before, where we've shown that our collective power is greater. And I often remind people and I'm going to close with this tonight. The one thing that I hope that people will remember is that the power of the people will always be greater than the people who are in power.
Laura, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That was great. Very happy to have you here this evening. I'm going to go now to Phil Pothen. Phil is the Ontario Environment Program Manager for Environmental Defence. He's a land use planning and environmental lawyer with 10 years of experience advising and representing provincial policymakers, small builders, and concerned residents. He joined Environmental Defence to advance quote unquote big picture approaches, a comprehensive alternative vision for development and industry that meets people's needs while preserving Ontario's natural spaces and farmland in perpetuity. I'm giving all the speakers between 8 and 10 minutes, and I'll go like this when you're coming to the end of your time. Phil, the screen is yours, sir.
All right. So thanks for having me, folks. I hope you can hear me all right. I just want to share, to start, an image that I think should be pretty scary and troubling to us as Torontonians. And this is, can you see this? There are two pie charts here. There's a pie chart, but the one in the top shows Toronto's current share of the GTA's population, Toronto's current clout within the GTA. And the one at the bottom shows the Ford's government's plan for Toronto's share of the GTA's population. And in this chart, so essentially right now we have roughly 40% of the GTA's population. The Ford government wants to a future in which less than 20% of the GTA's growth goes to the city of Toronto. And so this, at the crux of all of the problems that we are seeing around sprawl, and mixed with the motives that the province has, around, enriching well-connected landowners, there is this motive of weakening this troublesome part of Ontario, Toronto, by shifting the power base to the suburbs. And the side effect of this is that literally hundreds of thousands of people who we know want to live in Toronto and will want to live in Toronto under the next 30 years under the government's growth plan, they are essentially being exiled to outer GTA municipalities or out of the GTA altogether. And so what this looks like on the ground is that the Ford government has planned just around 730,000 new residents for Toronto over the next 30 years, when we know that naturally, it's very clear that at least 1.4 million people are going to want to live in Toronto over the next 30 years. And so what does that mean? That means that we are not planning enough homes for everyone who wants to live here. We are not going to produce enough homes for everyone who wants to live here. And what that means, particularly in an environment where the housing that we do have, only a small share of it is public housing, is that it becomes a privilege to live in the city of Toronto. So that even if you live in a low-rise neighborhood in Toronto, even if that in your experience and growing up, it was a mixed income neighborhood, as long as the number of homes in your neighborhood remains stable, as long as you do not inject a lot of new homes to your neighborhood, roughly twice the number that the Ford government is planning for you to add, then your neighborhood is going to become an elite enclave. And as I understand a lot of you are, partisan New Democrats, neighborhoods are going to become more and more hard and salted ground for progressives, just because the sorts of people who can afford to live in Toronto will increasingly be, even leaving aside the question of affordability, but because there are not enough homes for everyone who wants to live in Toronto, some people are going to be excluded, and those will be the people who get bid out. So the people who get bid out will leave Toronto. So this is a big concern to worry about. And so on my end of the political, my end of the process, I'm concerned with the effects at the other end more than anything else. I'm concerned with the effect of a plan that pushes most of the people who want to live in Toronto out into the suburbs on the environment in the suburbs, because that is a recipe. This is all the pretext for forcing sprawl into low density outskirts areas, not just of Peel and not just of York Region as we're used to, but way out into London, Ontario, and the outskirts of Waterloo, and further afield. And so, number one, this means that a key step, a key part of being someone who wants to stop sprawl, a key part of being someone who wants to see your neighborhood a place where different types of people can continue to live. It means advocating for Toronto to plan housing for a lot more people than the Ford government has assigned to. And it means your neighborhood planning housing for a lot more people than are assigned to it. And I'm trying to shift to my next document, which I don't know. I think I have a map here. Sorry, Mike. I hope you can hear me, because I'm not still supposed to be on this same image. There's a map which shows the other piece of this puzzle, which is that the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and I really wish I'm going to stop the share and see if that works. I'm just going to stop the screen share because we're moving on. But we have a map, which I wish to show you, which shows that in the GTA and Hamilton alone, there are already, under the Wynne government, 350 square kilometers of extra designated greenfield area. This is farmland and natural heritage. It was already marked for sprawl that has been sitting unused for years. And so this means that no part of the housing crisis today and the shortage of homes or the lack of affordable homes. No part of it is about any shortage of land to build homes on. Just to underline how vast our existing supply of land, the land that we've already condemned for development, we could double the rate at which we have been sprawling over the past 20 years and still not get through this existing supply of land by 2051. That's how much land we already have sitting unused. The figure that Peter referred to, the 2 million homes, that is the figure based on the government's own methodology, which is designed to vastly underestimate the capacity of existing land. In other words, that is the worst case, most conservative estimate that we would have for existing number of homes that we could build on this greenfield land if we didn't do anything to improve density or walkability. So in reality, we have all the land we need for the foreseeable future, not just for up to 2051, but for the foreseeable future already within our settlement boundaries. So that isn't, so we've talked about, well, we have room for 2 million homes and we don't need to touch the green belt, but it also means that we don't need to touch what's called the white belt, which is a large swath of land that's currently off limits for development, but not within the green belt. Our existing land supply is so large and the potential for our existing designated greenfield areas is so big. Yeah, Hector.
What are you doing?
I'm doing a meeting, buddy. You can sit here if you want. Sorry, I was putting them to bed and then I didn't get the long enough time to actually get them to fall asleep. Hey, so I think the reason why I'm jumping to this part is because I assume there is some overlap between those of you who are part of this meeting and previous meetings. But what this all boils down to is that I just kind of want to step back and maybe repeat a little of what we may have discussed before, is that Ontario, even under the Wynne government, was rapidly approaching an environmental cliff's edge because most of our existing neighborhoods lacked the density that they needed in order to be walkable, to support shops and restaurants within walking distance, to even keep schools open because we had declining enrollments in many neighborhoods. And certainly most of the GTA-aged neighborhoods do not have enough density to make it cost effective to provide frequent, reliable transit. So this was a massive source of built-in CO2 emissions that could not really be addressed simply by switching to EVs or zero emissions vehicles, because as we know, the government's plan for electricity is gas plants. So we actually need to shift what are now car trips through most of the GTA in neighborhoods that are currently car dependent to other modes of transportation. So we need to densify those neighborhoods. And at the same time, we need a more diverse mix of housing in neighborhoods in order to address the environmental justice crisis of low-income folks being priced out of the neighborhoods with the best amenities right now. And then the third piece of this puzzle is that we are already approaching very close to the tipping point when it comes to the land supply that wildlife, certain of our species at risk, need in order to survive. So already we were really at the edge of how far we could push Ontario ecologically. But we had just started to reform our land use planning. In 2018, the growth plan finally started to adopt some much needed reforms to increase the density of new development and to direct more of our growth to densification. And what is shocking is that we are so close to the edge, but the Ford government has abandoned any plan to change course. Just as we were starting to turn this transport truck around, the Ford government grabbed the wheel. And again, I really wish I could change pages here. Yeah, buddy. It's sleeping time. We could change. Sorry. So they've reduced the density at which existing greenfield land has to be built. So we have to use more land to house the same number of people. In places like Hamilton, Hamilton intended to direct. Oh, there you go. I'll let it go, and we can take it in questions later.
Okay. Phil, thanks very much. Folks, I'm going to ask people to put up hands, but I just want to say there was a question that was put forward, which was, why can't we do anything? And Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you because you actually did do something. You and the education workers shook up this province. Could you talk again about what the potential is to actually have an impact? What do we have to do?
Well, you know what? There's always a potential. The key is, are people ready to jump in and do the work? So the first thing that we do is we map out, and mapping is getting to know who in your community organization, who in your community, who in the area, who do you know, and who knows each other. So for instance, as a mom, I have a son who plays football. I have, a daughter who is in dance. Maybe there's a childcare center. And we start by having conversations, like old school door knocking conversations where we say, hey, Peter, can I talk to you about the importance of the Greenbelt? Can I talk to you about what this really means? Can I talk to you about how Bill 23 will eliminate developer fees and what that actually means to you as a resident? You start talking about those things. The secret to it is 70-30. You need to listen 70% and talk 30. Or as one of my teammates says, you have 2 ears, 1 mouth, use them accordingly. A little bit hard for someone like me to do, but it's a really good reminder. And you let people talk and you take note of it. And then collectively you say, okay. And then at the end of it, we also ask every single person, Peter, who else do you know that you could go talk to you about this? I see that this is something that really is a concern for you. I see that this is something you're passionate about. Who can you go talk? And you write it down. Peter says that he can go and talk to, Sally and George over at his faith group. He can talk to Sam and, Diane, who he has a wine club with. And you start building the power that way. One-on-one conversations, it's really old school organizing, right? I have a gentleman, Mike Gallipo, who's on my executive board, and he would say, this is as retro as it gets, Laura. But it's just one-on-one conversations and building that power, but also giving people hope that together you can actually make a difference. One voice itself may not be able to be heard, but 55,000 people heard it loud and clear.
Laura, thanks very much. I'm going to go to Phil as well, because Phil, environmental defense and environmentalists generally have been doing a lot of investigation. They've been coming after Ford. I have to say to everyone who's on the call today, that sitting in the legislature, the Tories do not look happy. Like, they are getting beaten up really well. They're being tenderized, one might say. And I would say that you, Phil, and environmental defense have been really critical to all that. Could you speak to how you see moving this government?
Sure. The key underlying premise of this entire approach to the Ford government, the thing that has them so uncomfortable, is that we have definitively undermined any credible explanation for what they're doing. And that meant the way we did that was not by doing the knee-jerk thing, right? Which is just, oh, you want to build housing, we protect the environment. The environment is more important than housing. We didn't go that route. We actually took seriously what the government was claiming to do, and we showed people another way to get there, a better way to get there. And so because of that foundation, because we showed that there was a much better, more realistic way to deliver all the homes we need, that is what led to this. That's what laid the framework for this investigation regarding, the government's relationship with these sprawl developers. Because in the absence of any credible reason for what it was doing, it made much more sense for the media to accept that there had to be a sinister reason for what the government was doing. Otherwise, it would just be, well, the developers were making a case that this was the right land to build. So the key to succeeding on all these issues is to kind of take seriously the concern that the government or the opposing side purports to be advancing, and make a better offer, right? So that's what we've done. So that's why the OPP is continuing to look around. There's a cone of silence there, on the governing side that's very hard to penetrate, as with any not so clean organization of that nature. But we are hopeful that they will eventually get there. And secondly, what we've done is we've reached outside of our core constituency of people whose primary concern is about the environment, to embrace people who are looking for more homes in existing neighborhoods, so that we refuse to allow ourselves to be wedged out. So those people now are increasingly on our side. So an organization like More Neighbors Toronto, which is not always the friendliest to progressives, they are out there saying the Ford government is corrupt for approving expansions into the Greenbelt. And so we are provoking fights between the leadership of that organization. And I don't know if you saw it last night, folks. There was a public fight between the leader of More Neighbors Toronto and Chris Spoke, the head of Ontario Proud, where More Neighbors was going to town on Chris Spoke. So we are reaching out, making alliances, not writing people off. That's the other part of organizing that I think we've had success with.
Phil, thank you very much. I have to say, folks, we're still waiting for Natalie to show up. She has a lot to say that I think everyone is going to hear. I wanted to make a quick comment about a note that you left. Barb Hogg said that she had heard that when 250,000 people carried out a demonstration in Toronto against the Harris government back in the 90s, that Harris's comment was "nice parade." And I just want to say to all of you, because I watch how the Tories operate, their whole technique really is to act as if the work that we're doing is irrelevant, has no impact on them. It's really critical for them as part of the demoralization. Laura, when you and the education workers were circling Queen's Park and you could be heard inside the building, you were not quiet. That had an impact on them. There's just no getting around it. It had an impact. So don't make a decision based on the way the Tories are presenting themselves. Remember, the days of action preceded the election that I believe it was 98, where the Tories lost quite a few seats in Toronto, and really their grip slipped, and then they were defeated in the next election. These are not overnight fights. The education workers didn't win this one after 1 year. They've been fighting for a long time. And so it is a hard, tough fight. It's frustrating that we can't win it more quickly, but it really is a question of getting large numbers of people in motion to have an impact. Now, I've got...
I just wanted to jump in there because the one thing that I would also add is we need to think outside the box. Queen's Park is not the only place where one can protest. I will be very honest with you. When we did our mass, yes, there was one at Queen's Park, and we did make a lot of noise, but simultaneously across the province, there were the similar size rallies happening, proportional size rallies, pardon me, happening across this province. We held parties, solidarity parties at NDP offices. We held pickets at Conservative. We were everywhere. And that's the other thing. When everybody is at Queen's Park, they're safe in their little clique, right? They're with their friends, they're with their buddies. But when there are 300 people that descend on their office, I can tell you that Stephen Lecce has never been to his office any single time that I've picketed there. He never shows up. And so he knows it because his workers are calling him saying, gee, this is a problem. So I think we also need to just consider, like, what is it that you need to target? Is it that we're targeting the construction sites? And I know that folks are saying, well, how do we do that without impacting the workers? You work with the workers, because I guarantee that the workers that are working for some of those, large, construction firms are not getting paid a fair wage as well, especially if they're in residential. They actually get paid very poorly in residential construction.
Laura, thanks very much for that. I'll just say to people, I recently was talking to a developer in Toronto who has got nothing to do with the Greenbelt. And he was just very angry at Doug Ford because he said, it makes all of us look like crooks. It stinks. And no one has any proof that things are crooked, but boy, the way it looks just makes everyone look like they're in on something really vile. Now, we're still waiting for Natalie. I'm hoping that she will be able to get to us very soon. I'm looking for any hands of people who would like to pose a question, preferably a question, but you may have a comment. Now, I know this is not a quiet and shy and retiring group. I mean, I know who you are. Well, I did just see a question there. Is there any sign of a public inquiry into what's happening in the Greenbelt? And I'll just say to everyone, the NDP has filed 2 requests to the Integrity Commissioner for examination of what's going on. And the NDP, joined by leaders of 2 other parties in the legislature, sent a letter to the Auditor General asking her to assess what had happened. I have to say, the Integrity Commissioner has to assess the information that he's been given and do his investigation. The Auditor General will do hers. The Integrity Commissioner, if he finds evidence of illegal activity, needs to turn that over to the OPP. The legislature does have the power to order an inquiry, but if you have a majority of votes in the legislature, no inquiry is going to go forward. So when we had the gas plant inquiry, the majority of seats in the legislature were held by opposition parties. And so though it was not easy, let me tell you, the committee meetings were pretty brutal. We were able to constitute a committee and actually put on the table the inquiry request. And I've noticed here, Toronto-Danforth NDP Riding Association has raised a hand. I will turn the floor over to you for commentary.
There we are. I forgot to unmute myself. Thanks, Peter. Susan McMurray, Toronto-Danforth resident, and also with the Labour Council. On Saturday, February 25th, there was a rally at Queen's Park, Welcome Back, Doug. And it had some of the people who are here today there speaking or in a supporting role. So, Phil was there talking about Bill 23. Laura was with Fred Hahn talking about some of the labor issues. Our Labour Council president in Toronto, Andrea Babington, spoke about labor issues. Natalie spoke about healthcare. Other education workers spoke about teaching. And part of the reason for the rally, and I think part of the reason for today, was to show the links among the different issues. And, for example, education work is green work, and education workers need somewhere to live. So from a climate perspective, they're doing work that isn't producing greenhouse gases. They're doing caring work, and they don't need big sprawling homes to live in or big honking highways that help developers get rich to get there. So I guess my question is whether either of the panelists or you, Peter, would like to talk about what you see yourself as some of those links among the environmental issues, the labor issues, the health issues, aside from the fact that it is part of this, shock doctrine playbook and an attempt to make the buddies rich.
Thank you very much for that, Susan. I'm going to ask the panelists to comment first, and if there's room, I'll jump in as well. Phil, do you want to start in on that?
I think I'll just let it go. Sorry, something. I'll pass on to the next person, and I'll jump in just after Laura, if that's okay.
I'm totally fine with that. Laura, it's yours.
So I think the first link that I really would bring up, and it's something that I think for some reason we've moved away from, is all labor has value. And for some reason, we have been brought up in a society where we aren't valuing the labor that every single, there is no such thing as unskilled work, right? All work is skilled work and all labor has value. And so I think what has happened is we've bought into this narrative, which, is being promoted by the right wing of, individualism and how different and unique all of us are. But I often remind that we all have far more in common than we do with the 1%, right? And, I think, we get so worried about individual pieces that we forget that united, there are so many things. Oh, that's the lights in my office as I go and turn those on. Welcome to energy saving offices, folks. How's this for green work? But I think that's the big challenge, is that people don't understand that we are letting ourselves be divided by the people who want to divide us. And I would encourage people to really think about it and think about how can you use the skills. I will repeat, the skills that we use in organizing can be used for anything. Once you've got it going, it's kind of like once you've trained for the marathon, the next marathon is much easier to run. And so I would, just a couple of things. All labor has value, and we have more in common than we do difference.
Okay, thank you very much. Phil has asked for a repeat of the question. Susan, would you repeat your question, please?
Sure. And I wonder if I can do another thing for just a moment before I ask the question again. I've made contact with Natalie Mara by cell phone. Natalie sends her regrets, but in fact, I have something I could read from her, which isn't specifically about healthcare, but it is the challenges of dealing with this government. If you're okay with that, Peter, I would read that very quickly. Yes, and then, so Natalie says, sorry, I'm not home yet. I had to take a call from our lawyers to go through legislation. The problem is the Ford government cut off debate on their bill to privatize the hospitals today and passed it through second reading. There's a whole schedule in it that deregulates the entire workforce, from doctors through nurses, through MRI techs, etc., for the private clinics. We may have 1 day notice and then 1 day of hearings. We have to get the analysis out by tomorrow morning. So it's an all-nighter for me. Right now, the lawyers and I are just trying to hammer through analysis of all the pieces of legislation this bill amends. I'm so sorry, I'm not going to make it home in time to jump on. They changed the rules of the legislature so they can slam through bills before we even have time to figure out everything they've snuck into them. Please explain for me. So I think in part that answers the question, and then I would just repeat for Phil, the question that I had was about the links among all the different issues that people talked about at Queen's Park on Saturday, that people are talking about today, links among climate, among health, education, worker issues, etc. Thank you.
Well, I think the sort of central point where a lot of these items are connected is around two conflicting visions of how places should be laid out. And this extends to some extent to healthcare, but especially to climate and housing and education. And that is, there's a vision that neighborhoods are essentially privileged places, clubs to be controlled by their existing residents, and clubs to be bought into, and a vision that would basically see us all scattered at low density across Ontario. And there's a vision for neighborhoods with enough concentration of people so that, like in Riverdale, you can generally get what you need within walking distance, and where homes are close enough together and compact enough so that you can fit a lot more people in the same area. And so on that sort of common thread hang, fundamental differences in how healthcare should be provided. So in outlying municipalities, they build hospitals as loss leaders for sprawl so often, right? And then, so this is why we have the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, who is always in lockstep with us, because they don't want to have to drive out to the hospitals. They don't want access to medicine being based on your ability to pay for a car to drive out there. They don't want low-income people to have to take cabs out to get access to healthcare. And then, the alternative is a place where a hospital is close enough to walk or take the bus to very conveniently, like we have here in Toronto with Michael Guerin in our neighborhood. And then, so on the other thing that connects it is this use of engineered crises. On the government side, the item that connects them is they will pick whatever the crisis of the day is, and there'll be really real problems, and use it as a post-rationalization for whatever they want to do anyway. So just to underline how cynical this is, right now, the excuse that the Ontario government is using for its sprawl, its push for sprawl, its use of MZOs to allow sprawl, its use of forced boundary expansions, is a very real shortage of housing. But this started at the start of 2020. And at the start of 2020, all of the same kinds of moves were being justified based on the COVID-19 pandemic. So that if the government wanted to expand a subdivision, it would nominally also, if they wanted to approve a subdivision out in the middle of farmland in the middle of nowhere, they would nominally allocate a long-term care facility in the middle of the planned sprawl subdivision and say, oh, the COVID-19 pandemic requires that we use an MZO to approve this long-term care facility. Oh, and by the way, there's a whole sprawl subdivision around it, right? So they cynically switch from that very real crisis, COVID, to another very real crisis, which is the shortage of homes, to do stuff which we are showing is not connected at all to it. And so in each of those cases, the answer is not to dismiss the reality of the crisis. It is just as wrong to dismiss the idea that there's a shortage of housing as to dismiss the idea that COVID-19 was a real pandemic, simply because we know that what the government is proposing as a solution is not going to help. We've got to take the crisis seriously, but challenge the sincerity of the government's approach supposedly to solving it, because it's always a post-rationalization. This is not a government with a real interest in solving problems.
Bill, thank you very much. I've got 3 people with their hands up. We've got just under 10 minutes. I'm going to go Joyce, Valerie, and Brian. Joyce, if you'd unmute yourself and make your comment or pose your question, we'll try and get 3 of you in.
Lovely, thank you. I just wanted to comment that, our problem is that Doug Ford is the legitimately elected leader of the province, and he won that position through our 2022 first past the post election, in which 40% of the voters voted for Progressive Conservatives and 60% voted for other parties. I'd like to see the three opposition parties find a way to agree that electoral reform is absolutely necessary for all of those three parties to gain their fair share of power. Otherwise, their voters, of which I am one, and probably everybody here is one, will continue to suffer from powerlessness, and the cost of now given climate change is just too high. And I know through my association with the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign that there's very, very great agreement that electoral reform is the underlying problem. So I'd like anyone, you, Peter, or anyone, Phil, or Laura, to maybe comment on that.
I can, and I'll be quick because I'll try and get to the others as well. The NDP supports proportional representation. The Greens do. I'm not sure the Liberals do. I don't think they do, but I could be wrong. And Joyce, I don't think it's a lack of agreement on the part of the opposition parties. It's that we have governments in power that oppose it, and they have been very successful. And with that, Joyce, I'm going to go to Valerie Laurie. Valerie, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi. I think in talking about what we can do and how all of these issues are linked, whether it's the crisis in healthcare or education or housing and the green belt and climate change, all of this is linked. There are so many people that are pissed off at the Ford government and what they're doing. And I know that in the Harris years, one of the things that chipped away at him and built people's willingness to go out to the voting booth again was the general strike. It scared the crap out of them, and it made Ontarians across the province realize that we were feeling the same way and we were in it together. And I wonder if there is truly yet any appetite to organizing a general strike.
I will leave that to our labor panelists. Laura, you're the most.
So there's a couple of things that I would say about a general strike. I think a general strike is one of those things that everyone talks about, but you've got to work for it. And it doesn't happen. You don't wake up one morning and say, today's the day I'm not going into work, right? Like when we had 55,000 people not go, it isn't like they woke up on November 4th and said, yeah, it's Friday, it's sun's out, I'm not going to go to work today. It took us a year to get to that point, right? A year, 50,000 conversations, like hundreds of thousands of conversations to get to that point. But the other thing that I want to say is that often I hear, oh, well, we need to have a general strike. And what are the unions doing to have a general strike? And I just want to be very clear. A general strike is not going to be led by leaders. It will be directed by workers. And so if workers want a general strike, workers need to talk together, because the reality is it's the workers that do the heavy lifting in general strikes. It's not the people that you see up at the podium. It's not the people that you see getting the media. Those aren't the people who do the heavy lifting in a general strike. It's every single worker who puts down their tools and takes that risk and says, no, I am not doing this anymore. I'm calling your bluff. And if people are willing to do that, hey, I'm all ears. I'll help you out. I'll help organize it. We'll set a date. But we've got to get to a point where people understand that it's all of us here in this room that will actually lead a general strike. That we will be the ones to direct a general strike. But waiting for leaders to do it, that's not going to happen.
Can I just add before we go to Brian, our last question? Laura, you can correct me on this, but the legislation that Ford brought in actually included a personal penalty of, I think, $4,000 or $5,000 a day per worker who walked out. People took big risks when they walked out. This is not, you're going to be docked a day's pay. No, these are really, really heavy duty sanctions.
And it was $4,000 per person per day, a personal liability, $500,000 for each union per day. And what's really amazing is the workers ended up in their collective agreement winning their days on strike back. So they actually got paid to protest the government in the final collective agreement.
Even more impressive than I thought.
Yeah. We said you're going to have to pay them, and there we did.
Okay. Brian, I think you're going to get the last question in.
Okay, yeah, it's more of a comment, and that's just sort of relates to the last few items that we talked about, like in terms of, how do we get that kind of general strike movement that we all really need to push back the for government agenda. And I just want to say that, I was one of the people that helped pull together the rally last Saturday, and one of the starting points for that, and going after Laura Walton is apropos, because I think the actions of the education workers really made gave a boost of confidence to all the struggles that are happening, that we can fight back against the Ford agenda and win. And it's not a coincidence that after that we saw an uptick in struggles against healthcare privatization. We saw an uptick in struggles against, in fact, amazing struggles against the Greenbelt proposals on housing, on all kinds of different issues. I think that was one of the reasons why February 25th, the quote unquote welcome back Doug party, protest party, was able to come together. It's a new coalition, and it shows that the ground is there for this kind of widespread. And I think these protests, as much as Ford might poo-poo them, or the government in power might poo-poo them, and it doesn't really matter to us. Again, it gives confidence to these struggles, and it lets them see who's my ally, who's with me on this. And I think we have to also remember that they've used the crisis of the pandemic to push a lot of this agenda through. But where were they before the pandemic? There were huge climate strikes in the fall of 2019. There was the whole country was shut down in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, rail strike, rail blockades, road blockades, ports shut down, forcing the government back to the table. And teachers were on strike against the Ford government at that time. So that anger has, if anything, gotten more hot, and there were struggles all the way through that kept the fire smoldering. I think we're in the point where that can really that resistance can really go forward. And I think it's never been more necessary, as what Natalie's comments show, that we really need to do this. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Brian, thank you very much. I'm going to bring Barb in for a last comment. I just wanted to say to everyone, the Ontario Nurses Association is holding a rally in front of the Sheraton Centre tomorrow at noon in support of their bargaining. And they're asking everyone who is standing up for workers' rights, for a good healthcare system, to come out and support them. I'll be there. I look forward to seeing all of you. Barb, your comment about the Ontario Health Coalition.
Hi, thanks. I'm with the Guelph District Health Coalition, and I just wanted to let everyone know if they could go onto the Ontario Health Coalition's website, become a defender. Probably what Natalie might have been going to talk about is the referendum that we're having at the end of May 26th, May 27th. If everyone could join meetings for their local health coalitions and become volunteers, we're going to need all the people that we can get to put out the boxes. We're doing a referendum. We're hoping to get 1 million ballots to take to Queen's Park before they end their sitting on June 1st. So if everyone could let their friends and family know to join some meetings with local coalitions. Your local coalitions are on the Ontario Health Coalition's website. So that's all I wanted to say. Natalie might have been telling you a bit about that.
Barb, thanks very much for that. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that you were able to get in and give us that information. I want to thank the panelists, the organizers who brought things together this evening. You did a wonderful job, Phil. As always, I enjoyed you. Laura, you had to leave, so I wish her the best. And to all of you who participated this evening, thank you for taking the time. This is a critical debate, critical fights. And frankly, as you all well know, it's not over by a long shot. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.